Howdy, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Hope you enjoy this.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. My name is Edgar Lujano, producer for Catholic Answers Live, and filling in for Cy Kellett today. This second hour, we are with Jimmy Akin, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, and also, as you know, the host of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, welcome to the show.
Hey, very glad to be back.
It's good to have you here. And it's not a Thursday, so I can't say what's up tomorrow, but I can ask what's going on Friday in Jimmy's Mysterious World.
Well, on Friday, we're going to be beginning a series, an occasional series, where we're going to look at so-called lost scriptures. These are things that are not in the Bible, but that in the past, at least some people thought that they were scripture. And we're going to kick off the series by looking at a work of Second Temple Jewish literature called the Book of Jubilees, and it's essentially a rewritten version of Genesis and part of Exodus, and it has some very interesting connections with the New Testament. It also fills out a bunch of things that are not in Genesis that you might wonder about, like who were those mysterious sons of God from Genesis 6 that gave birth to the Nephilim, and what were the names of Adam's daughters? You know, we hear about their sons, or at least some of their sons, but we don't hear about their daughters. And what were the names of the wives of Noah's sons? And what was Noah's wife's name? And things like that. So it fills in a lot of interesting detail.
Interesting. I didn't realize that we had some of that information written somewhere. All right, good to know.
Yeah, well, it's not, like I said, it's not in the standard Bible, but it's something that some people at one point did think was scripture.
Wow. Okay, well, there you
go. And
in
fact, a few still do, because it is in the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible.
Interesting. Okay. That's one of the earliest churches, isn't it? The Ethiopian church?
Well, they are fairly early. I mean, they do go back to apostolic times with the Ethiopian eunuch from Acts chapter 9, or chapter 8. But they, when they really began as a church is, something that's a little bit lost to the history of time, and it's not determinative of what the canon should be. But it is honored as canonical by some Christians today.
All right. Well, great. Well, there you have it. If you're looking forward to something on Friday, there you have Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on other writings that we can hopefully fill in some names, whether they're true or not, because we're not really sure about that, right?
Right.
So,
right.
Perfect. All right. Excellent. Well, here in the studio, on occasion, we get in-person guests, and today we have Alex visiting from Burbank. Welcome, Alex.
Hello, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I feel like I won a sweepstakes or something.
Well, I mean, if you're in Burbank, it's not too far, so you can win the sweepstakes pretty frequently if you want to drive down.
Oh yeah. That is amazing.
Yeah. Well, what's your question for Jimmy today?
Hi, Jimmy. So yeah, I was just wondering, in 1 Samuel 18, basically shortly after King Saul becomes jealous of David. There's a verse in there, I believe verse 10, where it mentions the Lord sent an evil spirit upon Saul. But obviously we know that, no evil comes from God. So I'm just not quite sure how to interpret that.
Yeah, so the fact that God never sends evil is something, well, okay. We need to distinguish between moral evil and physical evil. So moral evil is sin, and we know God is not into sin. God never leads anybody to sin. But historically, there's been a different view that's been taken of physical evil. Physical evil is things like pain and suffering. And there have been a lot of Christians throughout history who have proposed that God may send physical evils into our lives, perhaps as a punishment, or perhaps to purify us, or things like that. There's another view, which has gained ground recently, that would tend to say that God doesn't actually send the physical evils, but he allows the physical evils to come to us. In the Old Testament period, they didn't yet have a clear recognition of, they knew God was holy, but they didn't yet have a clear understanding of all of the implications of God's holiness. And so you will find places in the Old Testament where God is described as doing something like sending a lying spirit, a spirit that's going to deceive people. And that was an ancient Israelite way of talking about God's sovereignty. Today, looking at a passage like that, I wouldn't say that God deliberately was trying to deceive someone, but he allowed somebody to be deceived as part of his overall plans. And so I would tend to look at such passages in terms of what God allowed rather than what God directly caused. But in ancient Israelite literature, they were big into talking about God causing everything as a way of illustrating his mastery over the universe. So when you look at the passage where God sends an evil spirit upon Saul, what this spirit is doing is it's basically making him depressed. And he has David come and play the harp for him, and the evil spirit goes away and he feels better. One way of looking at that would be to say, okay, well, depression is not a moral evil. It's a physical evil. Even though we think of it as mental, really it's what philosophically and theologically would be called a physical evil, because it's not sin, it's not moral. And so one way of looking at that would be to say, okay, essentially God allowed David to become depressed. His spirit became bad, and then David was able to lift his spirits by playing the harp for him. However, there's also another way of looking at that, which is in terms of an exorcism. There have been interpreters of this passage in the past who have thought when it says God sent an evil spirit upon Saul, it means not just the kind of spirit that we sometimes read about that like reflects our mental and emotional state, but an actual evil spirit, a literal one, like a demon. And that by playing the harp, you'll find this in some Jewish traditions, by playing the harp, David exorcised this spirit, at least temporarily. He was able to drive this demon away from Saul so that his mood lifted. It's also possible to read this not in terms of, now, God is punishing Saul here by allowing this or by sending the spirit. But that's another question you got to ask about it. Is God just allowing this evil spirit to come to Saul, or is God actively sending the evil spirit upon Saul? So you kind of have two questions. Is it a literal evil spirit like a demon, or is it more of a figurative spirit, like where Paul in the New Testament refers to us having like a spirit of confidence and a spirit of strength, when really he's talking about our own personal spirits and qualities they have? Or is it talking about an exterior spirit like a demon? And then secondarily, you have to ask, is God actively causing this spirit to come upon Saul, or is he just allowing the spirit to come upon Saul? But either way, I think that there are solutions that fit with God's overarching holiness and righteousness.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was amazing.
All right. Well,
no problem.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for popping in, Alex. Really appreciate the visit. And again, you're not too far away, so you can win the sweepstakes again.
Oh, yeah, of course. Come and bother Sai, too, when he's back.
Perfect. Yeah, there we go. All right, cool. Thanks, Alex. All right. With that, we're going to go to our first break, since it's just about that time. When we come back, we'll go ahead and get to your calls. And if you want to go ahead and give us a call, you can at 888-318-7884, and that's 888-31-TRUTH.
Stay with us for more Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Magnificat. Published monthly, Magnificat features texts of daily Mass, prayers, articles, meditations, art commentaries, and more, in step with the liturgical rhythm of the Church, on the web at magnificat.com.
Hi, I'm Debbie Georgiani. Adam Bly and I invite you to join us as we tackle the spirit world on EWTN Radio. Adam has assisted at thousands of solemn exorcisms and resolutions of hauntings. He also reaches out to educate people on the paranormal and the occult in our culture. Join us Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern for the Spirit World on EWTN Radio.
Catholic Answers Live. Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Aiken on this second hour. And with that, to the phones we go. We go directly to Nicholas in Canada, listening on Twitch. Nicholas, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go right ahead.
Okay, thanks very much for your time, sir. I may be proceeding from some false premises. I'd appreciate it if you correct any misconceptions I have, but then move to answer the larger point. I'm trying to understand in what sense the Church teaches Jesus is God. I don't understand how a thing could have two natures. It seems two natures entails two things that are different. If I were under the delusion that I were God, I would argue against that by appealing to my human nature, which is not consistent with God's nature. Other examples that confuse me are the pillar of smoke and fire being God, the burning bush being God, and the bread and the wine of the Eucharist each being both species.
Okay. Well, I guess one place to start with this question would be to talk about the difference between an entity or a being and the nature or natures that it has. So an entity or a being is something that exists. It's something that bees. And so Jesus exists, so he's a being. And the burning bush was a bush, so it was a being. The Eucharistic elements exist, so they're beings. And then in addition to the mere fact that something exists, it has at least one nature that tells us what kind of thing it is that exists. And in the case of God, the belief is that he is one being, one thing that exists, that has a divine nature. He's also three persons, but that's a separate issue that you haven't asked about, at least yet. But he has a divine nature intrinsically. And that divine nature gives him the attributes of divinity. So he's uncreated, he's immortal, he's eternal, he's outside of time, he's omniscient, he knows everything, he's omnipotent, he can do anything, and so forth. So God intrinsically has a divine nature, and since Jesus is one of the persons of God, he has that divine nature. But then the Christian claim is that at the Incarnation, he took on a second nature, which was human. And so the human nature has different attributes than the divine nature. Humans have finite knowledge rather than infinite knowledge. So Jesus, in his human nature, had a finite mind with finite knowledge. Also, humans have power, but it's limited finite power. So in addition to his divine nature, which had infinite power, he also has a human nature that has finite power. The divine nature is spiritual and thus does not involve matter, whereas human nature does involve matter. So that's why Jesus had a body. And we don't normally in this world see things with two natures, but it's not logically impossible for something to have two natures and be united in one being. So according to the Christian way of looking at things, God is omnipotent, which means he can bring about any state of affairs that doesn't involve a logical contradiction. So God can make unicorns if he wants. He can make Klingons if he wants. He can make any kind of bizarre thing you want as long as it doesn't involve a logical contradiction. So there are some things God can't make, which are basically word salad entities, like a circle with a square perimeter. Circles don't have square perimeters, and so the idea of a square circle is just logical nonsense. There's no way to cash that out in the real world. Similarly, a four-sided triangle. You can say four-sided triangle, but it's word salad. It doesn't really correspond to anything that could possibly exist because there's a logical contradiction between the idea of having four sides and being a triangle. Triangles, by definition, having three angles and three sides. So as long as something is not, even if it's really strange, As long as something doesn't involve a logical contradiction, it's something that God can bring about due to his omnipotence. And there doesn't seem to be any logical contradiction between saying you can have one being that has more than one nature. And so the claim is that by his omnipotence, God actualized that state of affairs for Jesus. So he intrinsically has his divine nature, which he has always had and always will have. And then beginning about 2 or 3 BC, when Jesus was conceived, or maybe 4 or 3 BC, he acquired a second nature, which was a human nature. And the attributes of those two natures are different, but even though they're united in one person, they are still distinct. So it's not like they fused and got elements of each other. They are united, but nevertheless distinct natures. And there's no contradiction between saying that a single being like Jesus could have two natures. In terms of the burning bush, the standard way of interpreting that is not so much that the bush was God, but that God manifested through the bush. And so this was an instance where God intervened in nature to make his presence known. But the burning bush is different than Jesus, because in Jesus you have a single person with two natures, but the standard interpretation of the burning bush is that God did not become one person with the bush. The bush was a separate created entity, and God simply manifested his presence through the bush. When it comes to, I think the other one you mentioned was the Eucharistic elements, those are the Catholic understanding of those is that they lose their actual original nature as or they lose their separate existence as entities. They cease to be bread and wine, and all that remains of them, again, this is by God's omnipotence, all that remains of them are the appearances, which are and those appearances, the appearance of bread and the appearances of wine, are then masking the actual presence of Jesus, who has become present under them. So you raised quite a number of different issues there that get us into some fairly deep philosophical waters at times, but that's kind of a brief summary of how Christians and Catholics in particular would look at those elements.
Thank you. Could I ask a follow-up?
Real quick.
Why can God make a God-man, but he can't make a triangle with a square perimeter? Why can't he join those two natures together? Or have two natures in one being in that way?
Mm-hmm. Well, he could join a triangle and a square, or a quadrilateral. He could join them together, but that's different than having a four-sided triangle. I mean, I could take a piece of paper and cut out a triangle and cut out a square or some other quadrilateral, and then I could tape them together, and they would be united as a single new shape. But that single new shape would not be a four-sided triangle. And that's essentially what we have going on with the incarnation of Christ. He has a divine nature, and that divine nature has become attached to a human nature, so that they form one person. But if you're talking about actually making a four-sided triangle, there's no way to do that, because that involves a contradiction in terms. Whereas saying we've attached a human nature to a person that has a divine nature, that does not involve a contradiction in terms. So to use the analogy you've proposed here, what God did in the incarnation would be more like attaching a triangle to a square, but that doesn't result in them becoming the logically contradictory four-sided triangle.
All right, Nicholas, and we'll go ahead and leave it right there because all the lines are full and I want to get to as many people as possible. And we move on to Emma in Hayden, Idaho, listening on YouTube. Emma, welcome to the show.
Hey, guys. Jimmy, about a month ago, I talked to you about hearing voices, and you want help, so I just want you to know I applied that. But you said something that haunted me. You said there are other reasons with people voices, not just mental illness or other things, and I'm hoping that you can explain that.
Okay, I remember our call in very basic terms. I'm afraid I don't remember all the details of what we discussed, but there are a variety of different causes that can result in someone hearing voices. And so I'll just do a quick survey of some of them, and then you can tell me if I've answered your question or not. Some of the things that can cause people to hear voices are purely natural. And these fall into two general categories: pathological and non-pathological voices. Non-pathological voices that have a natural cause would be things like just stuff that bubbles up from our subconscious, but that doesn't really cause us any notable problems. All of us have what I sometimes call a dream module that is responsible for what we experience when we're dreaming. And obviously we hear people talking in our dreams. Our dream module invents what these other characters are saying to us in our dreams. And there's nothing pathological about that. There's nothing unhealthy about that. It's not a problem. Well, sometimes the permeability between our sleeping and waking states is not as solid as it could be. There's a subject that's sometimes discussed in psychology called transliminality, which means or can mean the ability of something to kind of cross that threshold between the subconscious and the conscious. And so sometimes we could have our dream module active even though we're conscious, and some of the content that our dream module is coming up with may bubble up into our consciousness. So we might hear a word or a phrase or a sentence or something like that, just kind of randomly, but it's not a sign of mental illness because it's not causing us any problems. On the other hand, there are then pathological hearing of voices where, if your dream module is on all the time and you're getting all this dream content, including voices in your waking life to the point that it is causing problems, like you're hallucinating or, constantly hearing voices that, that are disruptive, then that becomes pathological. And there are a variety of different psychological conditions where that can happen. Schizophrenia is one of them, but there are others besides schizophrenia. In addition, there are other situations, some of them physiological conditions, like having a brain tumor or things like that, that can be responsible for an otherwise healthy person hearing voices. Then there are paranormal causes for people hearing voices. It could be that they are in their and this is at least what some parapsychologists would claim, maybe a person's telepathically picking up on the thoughts of other people elsewhere, and that's why they're hearing voices. Or maybe they're hearing from a spirit, either a departed human spirit or an angel or God or something like that. And so in any given instance, we have to look at, the whole situation a person finds themselves in. We have to look at both natural and paranormal causes that could be responsible for the voices, and we also have to look within the natural causes for, is it pathological or is it non-pathological? Is it medical? Is it psychological? So there are a variety of different causes that can be responsible for someone hearing voices, but it's hard to go further than just here's a list of some of the possible explanations without having a full briefing on the situation and what the person is encountering and running various medical tests and so forth.
How's that, Emma?
Oh, that's good. I want to give you just a little bit more information. A lot of them had names.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, that, this is real unsettling for me. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
But like when I was a child, there was a little boy, and there are other voices, and they name themselves. I don't
Mm-hmm.
name them.
Okay.
So, go ahead.
The mere fact that, and we're coming up on a hard break, but the mere fact that a voice provides a name for itself, that's just one more thing the voice says. It doesn't really tell us anything about the origin of the voices. It could be that it's an imaginary voice, something from your subconscious that, say, your dream module has come up with that's decided to name itself. It could be that it could be, from a psychological cause. It could be a spirit that's naming itself. It could be a spirit that's lying about who it is. So the mere fact that something names itself doesn't really allow us to establish what the origin of this voice is.
Emma, we'll go ahead and leave it right there because we're, like Jimmy said, we're going to our hard break. So thank you for your call. And if you have a question for Jimmy, we're going to have one line open. You can go ahead and call us at 888-318-7884. That's 888-31-TRUTH. And we'll be right back with some more questions with Jimmy.
This year, the Catholic Answers Conference turns to the parables, sermons, and conversations of Jesus Christ. Join special guests Scott and Kimberly Hahn, Dr. Ray Garendi, and an all-star lineup of speakers September 26th through 29th. Spend time with your favorite Catholic Answers apologists and our special guests right here in beautiful San Diego. Seats are still available, but going fast. Use promo code EARLY to save $50 and register today at CatholicAnswersConference.com.
When it comes to Catholic teachings about Mary, there's one question we hear more than any other. Where is that in the Bible? The answer? Everywhere. In Bible Mary, the Mother of Jesus and the Word of God, Father John Weiss opens Scripture to reveal a Mary who has been hiding in plain sight. Order your copy of Bible Mary today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
If you're not a Bible scholar, the full message of how the Sunday Mass readings fit together can be tough to comprehend. Apologist Carlo Broussard is here to help. Join Carlo every Friday for the Sunday Catholic Word podcast. In each episode, he unpacks the scripture readings for that Sunday and brings them all together so you can better understand and defend the faith. Visit SundayCatholicWord.com to subscribe. That's SundayCatholicWord.com.
Matt Swaim here. Tomorrow on the Sunrise Morning Show, we'll celebrate Independence Day with our 4th of July special and mark the feast day of Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. Now back to Catholic Answers Live.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. My name is Edgar Lujano, filling in for Cy Kellitz as he continues on the cruise on the St. Lawrence River. And we continue with Jimmy on Ask Me Anything. And we have another guest in the studio. We have Rachel, also coming from Burbank. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, it's good to have you here. Well, what do you have? Do you have a question for Jimmy today?
Yep, absolutely. So, hi, Jimmy. So I wanted to ask, my spiritual director has been cautioning me against using novenas and relics sort of as magic and assuming that every time I use them or pray them that I'm going to get what I want. However, in last week's gospel, we heard the story of the woman with hemorrhages and how she was healed purely because she believed by touching Jesus's cloak she would be healed, right? So I guess my question is, how can one have that sort of faith without treating a thing like magic? Because it seems to me that she went, this thing will heal me, and became healed, you know? So I just don't understand how you can do that.
Yeah. So we've got the term magic involved here, and one of the most difficult problems in anthropology is how to define the term magic. It gets used in a bunch of different ways, and different people use it differently. And there have been a bunch of proposed definitions for what counts as magic and what doesn't. Now, I did a whole episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. It's episode 79 on religion, magic, psychic phenomena, and science, where I went through those 4 categories and talked about what each one of them would mean. Now, one way of thinking about something as magical would be attributing to it more significance than it actually has, and as if it has some kind of intrinsic efficacy, it'll automatically bring about its effect, and so forth. Before I get to that, though, I want to back up and talk about where the term magic comes from. So it's a Greek term, magikos, and it's derived from the word magos, which originally referred to a particular tribe of Persians. The Magoi they were a priestly tribe, kind of like the Jewish tribe of Levi. So if you were an ancient Persian and you wanted certain rituals done, you would go to a magos, a member of the tribe of the Magoi, and he would do religious rituals for you. Like, say, if you were offering a sacrifice, the magos would, chant the hymn of the origin of the gods or stuff like that. And what happened was people then in the Greek world came into contact with magoi who were doing their religious rituals, and eventually the term magos was applied to anybody that was doing a ritual like the magoi. Magoi is just the plural of magos. And so if you're doing a ritual that's kind of like the magoi, you got called a magos. And you didn't have to be Persian. In fact, in the New Testament, we read about figures who were even Jewish, but they were called magoi because they were doing rituals that in some way reminded people of the rituals that the magoi would do, the Persian ones. And basically what would happen is any kind of foreign rite, any kind of foreign ritual was regarded as being kind of shady. And so the term magic, to my mind, is best defined as a ritual that is not approved in the local community. It's like a shady foreign thing. We don't do that here. And so I think that the term magic is best used in a neutral way that simply refers to any unapproved ritual or any disapproved ritual. But that's a little bit different than what your spiritual director was suggesting, which is attributing a kind of intrinsic efficacy to, say, in a novena or something like that. And there are some devotions that you will have people make big claims for. You say this devotion and a 1,000 souls get out of purgatory, or you say this devotion in the right way and you're guaranteed to have a good death and stuff like that. And I've always been very suspicious of claims like that. What we have to do is recognize that everything is ultimately subject to God's choice. God, unless we have a promise from God, which we do with the sacraments, that if we do this ritual, God will respond in this way. So if the priest, a properly ordained priest, says, this is my body and this is my blood, it will become Jesus's body and blood. We have God's promise on that. But if we don't have a promise, which we don't, a promise that we're certain of, in the case where God has definitely committed himself, which we don't have in the case of private devotions, then we have to ultimately leave things up to God's will. In the case of the woman with the hemorrhage, who has faith that God will heal her, she definitely has faith. But I would suppose that, and I can't read her mind, but I would suppose if you asked her and said, it's clear you have faith in what God is doing through Jesus, so that if you touch him, you'll be healed of your hemorrhage. But do you recognize that that if God chose, he doesn't have to grant that? I would suppose that she would say, yeah, I recognize that. It's subject to God's will. But even though I recognize that it's subject to God's will, whether or not I get what I'm after, I still have faith that God can do this and that he will do it for me. And so I'm going to act on that basis, but still it's subject to God's choice, to his will. And as long as a person has that caveat of ultimately it's up to God, and I don't have an infallible promise that this will definitely have its effect, then one is not attributing too much significance to the performance of the devotion. The term that I would tend to use, rather than magic, because I think that's best used for disapproved or unapproved rituals, the term I would use is the term that St. Thomas uses, which is superstition. Superstition is attributing too much to something. And so if you attribute an infallible efficacy to something where we don't have a promise from God that's equally certain, I would say that's superstitious. It's not. I wouldn't say it's magical, because it may be a totally approved, devotion you're using, but it would be superstitious in that you're attributing too much to the performance of this devotion. And so rather than bringing the kind of fraught term magic into it, I would tend to use the term superstition in this kind of situation. So I would say the woman with the hemorrhage of blood was having faith, but I suspect if we were able to ask her, she would not end up being superstitious with regard to this. On the other hand, maybe she was superstitious and God just chose to reward her faith anyway.
How's that, Rachel?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. That's something I've sort of been struggling to understand, so I appreciate your perspective.
No problem.
All right, Rachel. Well, thank you so much for joining us here in the studio.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again. It was great.
All right. Well, thank you. All right. Well, with that, we continue on.
Now, for some reason, I want to sing "All the Nations of the World."
Oh yeah, the shirt.
United States, Mexico. Anyway.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect. It's funny because I remember showing that to my students when I used to be a high school teacher. And they would look at me like, "This is what you used to watch when you were younger. This is strange." But then again, I look at the stuff that they watch, and it was just weird. So,
yeah. For people who may not know, that's an Animaniacs reference.
Yes, I love the Animaniacs. Anyways, all right, continuing on, we go to Andrew in Los Angeles, listening on Catholic.com. Andrew, welcome to the show.
I'm a huge fan, and I love how you take all the weird questions seriously. I called in earlier, but John told me to ask you my question, so here I am.
Okay.
So one of our arguments for deuterocanonical books in the Old Testament is the presence of them in the Septuagint, right?
Mm-hmm.
Andrew, your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, but if you could just continue on, don't worry about whether we can hear you. Just ask your question.
All right. Yes. So I saw online that someone saying that the New Testament authors didn't quote the Septuagint, which I thought was wrong because a priest told me that the Septuagint is Matthew's Bible, and he quotes from it word for word at some points. So I went around looking for citations to prove this person wrong, because I don't like to just tell people they're wrong. I'd like to prove it, but I'm open to having my mind changed. So after doing some digging, I found some conflicting sources disagreeing whether the Septuagint is quoted in the New Testament. I saw some comparisons of the translations to English side by side of the Old Testament passages in the Septuagint, Matthew and Luke, and the Masoretic text. And from what I had seen, I was inclined to believe that the Masoretic texts were translated into Greek by Matthew instead of quoting the Septuagint. At the same time, one of my friends did point out that the Masoretic texts were dated at the 6th century, So I'm not sure what to make of all of this. What are your thoughts?
Okay. So it is among biblical scholars, there is no doubt that the New Testament authors overwhelmingly quote from the Septuagint. This is something that Protestant scholars agree with. This is Protestant scholars, Catholic scholars, Orthodox scholars, Jewish scholars. Everybody agrees that the New Testament overwhelmingly quotes from the Septuagint. Now, that doesn't mean, or at least the tradition to which the Septuagint belongs. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't occasions where they're translating directly from a Hebrew original. And you're right, the Masoretic text is later. But, there are some instances where they do quote from a Hebrew original, but the vast majority of the time, they're quoting from the Septuagint tradition. And to give you an example of a book that documents that, there is a work called Old Testament Quotations in the New Testament, a complete survey. And it goes through, it shows you the quotation in Greek, it shows you in the New Testament, it shows you the Septuagint, it shows you the Masoretic text, and it classifies them based on how close the Greek New Testament mirrors one or the other. This book is by two authors, both of whom are evangelical. Gleason Archer, who was a very famous evangelical scholar, and his co-author, Gregory Chirichingo. And they have a summary up front. Now, most of the book is just taken up with the quotations, but they've got a summary up front. And if you add up the different number of quotations in each category, it turns out, depending on how you count them, that the New Testament is quoting from the Septuagint tradition 80 to 90% of the time. So the overwhelming majority of quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament are based on the Septuagint.
Andrew?
Thank you so much. I called in because I couldn't find any primary sources on the internet. So thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, Andrew. And with that, we're going to go to our final break for the hour. So if you want to go ahead and talk to Jimmy, you can call us at 888-318-7884.
You're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
This is Monsignor Chuck Kosanke. We need Catholic radio to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to the whole world. It's a modern means to reach the hearts and minds of Catholics and all people, and to have the Church's teaching proclaimed and taught authentically, and also to convey the Church's news from an authentic perspective.
The world needs EWTN Catholic Radio, now more than ever.
Who was the first Catholic in your family? Were they evangelized by a friend, a coworker, a stranger? Did you ever think that you could be that person that God uses to save a soul? And that soul could save their family, their grandchildren, and generations to come. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we train, equip, and mobilize Catholic disciples to do the urgent work of evangelization. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Welcome back, Catholic Answers Live. Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. Well, Jimmy, before I go back to the calls, one thing came to mind when Rachel was asking her question, the term magic, and you were breaking down the different categories. One thing I remember as a kid listening is hearing a distinction between black magic and white magic. Is there such a thing?
Well, according to practitioners, yes, there are several different categories of magic that have been proposed, and there is a difference between trying to use magic to have a positive rituals, which is really what we're talking about, trying to use rituals to have a positive effect, like healing someone of a disease, versus trying to use them to have a harmful effect, like making someone sick. And in Latin, the term for the latter is maleficium. And so whereas other terms could be used for attempts to help someone by performing a ritual for them. However, just because there is a distinction between trying to use these means for one goal and trying to use them for another goal, it doesn't mean that this is an approved way of proceeding. If it's an unapproved ritual, it's an unapproved ritual. So just because you can use it in different ways or attempt to use it in different ways doesn't mean what you're doing is okay. There's also a distinction between what's called natural magic and what's called ceremonial magic. Natural magic involves relying on principles that are built into nature, whereas ceremonial magic involves conjuring a spirit and getting the spirit to do what you want. And in the Christian Middle Ages, there were many people who would argue, well, this is before the scientific revolution. They would argue, well, there's nothing wrong with using principles that are built into nature. And so an example of something in nature that had no known explanation was how do magnets work. And so you would have people would say, well, the power that's in a magnet is clearly something that God built into nature, but he hasn't chosen to reveal it to us, so it's hidden from us. And the Latin word for hidden is occultus. So the power of magnets was occult, but that didn't make using magnets bad. In the same way, when Sir Isaac Newton, during the scientific revolution, proposed the theory of gravity, he didn't have any explanation for how it works. He knew that these equations will describe the motions of objects. But one of the things that was kind of alarming to people in his day is the idea of gravity contradicted the established physics of the day, which was Aristotelian. In Aristotelian physics, there's no such thing as action at a distance. You can't have one object having an effect on another object without some kind of medium between them to transmit that effect. It's like you can't hear my voice without the air between us to carry the sound waves from my voice. So I can't shout at you over a vacuum, as the movie of the tagline for, I think it was, I won't say it because I'll get it wrong, but as a famous 1980s movie said, in space no one can hear you scream because of that vacuum. Well, in Aristotelian physics, people thought everything worked like that you had to have a medium to transmit an influence. And with gravity, you didn't need that. Gravity could work across empty space. And so people accused Isaac Newton of introducing a concept from natural magic into what later became physics. And in fact, a lot of natural magic has now been transformed into modern science, leaving ceremonial magic to one side. And Christians have tended to be much more down on ceremonial magic. You shouldn't be calling up spirits. If you want to figure out how to use gravity or how to use magnets, that's fine, but don't be calling up spirits.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. The more you know. Thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate you taking my call or my question. All right. With that,
I just hope they put it in the question list for today.
Yeah, there we go. Maybe they should. All right. Now we go to Pamela in the Pacific Northwest, listening on YouTube. If you can go ahead straight to your question, Pamela, I really appreciate it.
Yes, I understand. Sorry. Let me just make it be as quick as possible. I've been watching Jimmy's show for years, talking about near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, deathbed experiences, and my experience at 12 years of age just doesn't fit into any of the categories. And I've been thinking about calling for years. So,
okay, what happened to you? What was your experience?
I was raised by my mother till I was 12. At 12, she came home and said, "You're going to go live with your father," who I barely knew. I was with him a month up in Washington State and found out we were moving to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I was there for 2 years. I didn't know my father was an atheist. And my mother never took me to church. She just dropped me off for my childhood. So I always was in church alone, Christian church. Anyway, once I got to Cuba, I found out I couldn't have a Bible. I couldn't go to church. He talked all the time about there is no God. And so I was pretty much immersed in an atheist household where I didn't even dare bring the subject up. My best friend at school, I finished 7th grade in Cuba, and my best friend and I were spending summer nights, overnights with each other. It was at my home.
Pamela, just so you know, we're getting quite close to the end of the show.
I'm trying to say what happened now. I had to give you the backdrop of how isolated I was with no one to talk to. And so I told her I was crying. She got to go to she was Lutheran, got to go to church every weekend with her parents. But I thought God thought I didn't love him anymore because I wasn't going to church anymore. I didn't know what to do, and I was beside myself. The next thing I knew, I was like gone. And when I came back to myself, she said I was gone for about 4 minutes. And then she asked me I told her what my experience was. I wanted to tell you what my experience was as quickly as possible now.
Please do.
Go ahead. I can't hear you, but go ahead.
Please do tell me your experience.
Yes. The first thing that I recall after I didn't see her anymore or anything, I was laying, I guess, back on the bed. I fell back on my bed, was that I started going reverse, and I was only 12 years old. Reverse through my life with quick stops at any time I had done something wrong. For instance, telling a lie. And I knew God was like having me address it. And then I knew as I went backwards, all the way to the womb, it was really weird. I was recalling every sinful thing I had done by the age of 12. Then there was a huge spark. And I knew I was not, that's when I actually knew I wasn't in my body. This huge spark occurred. And I knew I was pre-womb, like in a spot where I had started before I was in my mother's womb. And then I just simply had the experience that's so common to everyone. A huge envelopment of bright, loving light, a sensation I cannot even describe. And then two specific things, 3 things were said to me. And then next thing I remember is I was opening my eyes again, laying back on my bed. What I was told is, I'm your father. No one on earth is your actual father. I made you. I will always be with you, and don't be afraid. And that was the message.
Okay.
It caused me.
Pamela, sorry, I'm going to have to pause you right there. I want to make sure that Jimmy has enough time to at least give you an answer. Are you familiar with the experience like this, Jimmy?
Yeah, so this experience incorporates various elements of other experiences. And so in general terms, if I were going to provide a basic name for this, I could say it's a religious experience. In particular, it may be, and I'd have to know more about it, which we don't have time. If Pamela wants, she can email me at jimmy@catholic.com to give me a fuller description. But basically, it also is what historically might be called a rapture. A rapture being an experience where one is taken out of oneself or is lost in a vision or something like that and not really aware of one's surroundings. It also incorporates an element of what's known as a life review, where one reviews aspects of one's life with an eye to whether or not they were good or bad. Life reviews are commonly reported as part of near-death experiences, but they also can occur in other contexts. And it sounds like Pamela had a life review as part of this experience. It also seems that, she saw light, she heard a voice that identified itself as God, and that's, a visionary because of the light and a locutionary because of the voice experience. So it sounds like what she reports happening to her incorporates elements of various different experiences that are known. And if I had to give an overall name to it, I'd say it was a religious experience that took the form of a rapture, incorporating a life review and a vision and locution from God. There's potentially more there, but that's what I'd say based on the limited time we've got available.
Pamela, thank you so much for your call. Like Jimmy said, if you want to give him a full experience, go ahead and send him an email. Jimmy, thank you so much for another day and another hour with you.
My pleasure.
All right, and I hope you have a great Independence Day, and thank you for this. God bless.
Likewise. And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless you.